Okay, let's start. Number 1. The War Scroll. You're inside a limestone cave above the Dead Sea in the spring of 1947. A Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Adidib has just thrown a rock into a crack in the cliff face and heard something shatter. He reaches inside and pulls out a clay jar sealed at the top. Inside the jar, wrapped in linen, is a roll of deteriorating leather covered in dark, precise Hebrew script. He doesn't know what it says. He sells it to an antiquities dealer for a few dollars. The scroll passes through 3 more hands before any trained scholar looks at it. When they do, they recognize it immediately as ancient. They do not recognize what it describes. The scroll is from Cave 1 at Qumran, on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. It is catalogued as 1QM. Scholars call it the War Scroll. The community that wrote it called it the Rule of War for the Final Battle. 11 caves at Qumran were excavated between 1947 and 1956, producing more than 900 manuscripts, the largest collection of ancient Jewish texts ever found, predating the next oldest surviving Hebrew Bible manuscripts by over 1,000 years. The Israel Antiquities Authority controls physical access to the originals. Translations were released in stages so slowly that independent scholars spent decades filing formal demands for access to documents the official team had been sitting on for 40 years. The War Scroll was among the first found and among the last fully explained. Here's what makes military historians uncomfortable when they read it carefully. The scroll runs 49 columns. It describes, in operational precision that has no parallel in ancient religious literature, a 40-year war between 2 forces it identifies as the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. Not a spiritual war as metaphor, a war with formations, rotations, logistics, and weapons specifications. Yigal Yadin of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem published the first major scholarly analysis in 1962. What he found was that the tactical structure described in the War Scroll, the spacing of infantry columns, the rotation of combat divisions, the coordination of flank units by trumpet signals maps more closely onto Roman military doctrine than onto anything produced by a Second Temple Jewish community. The Qumran community was writing battle plans that matched Rome's best military organization centuries before Rome was the dominant regional power. Yadin's explanation was cultural influence. The community had absorbed Roman tactical thinking and reframed it in theological language. Here's what that explanation doesn't address. Column 14 of the War Scroll describes projectile weapons with an accuracy of deployment that, if taken literally, implies targeting capability no known ancient military technology produced. The Hebrew vocabulary for those weapons has no cognate in any other ancient Near Eastern military document. Translators render the key term as instruments of destruction, which is accurate. The way translating rifle as metal tube is accurate, it describes the category without describing the function. Column 9 uses a phrase appearing 3 times across the scroll, repeated verbatim each time. A consuming fire that does not burn the ground. The phrase is not metaphorical in any context the scroll gives it. It describes an effect produced on enemy formations. Mainstream scholars classify it as apocalyptic imagery. Military analysts who have reviewed it use different language. The Sons of Darkness are not identified as a neighboring kingdom. Not Babylon, not Assyria, not Rome itself. The scroll describes them as a force that has existed since before human civilization. Their commander is named. The name appears in no other historical record from the ancient Near East, not in Babylonian documents, not in Egyptian texts, not in any known corpus of ancient writing. Whatever the commander of the Sons of Darkness is in the scroll's cosmology, it is not a human king of a human nation. The War Scroll translation was completed and published in full by 1977. The original physical scroll sits in the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, under nitrogen atmosphere in a climate-controlled vault. Visitors can see a full-length replica. The authentic scroll is not available for independent analysis. Researchers requesting spectral imaging or materials testing for independent dating have been consistently redirected to the published facsimiles. Why does a desert religious community produce a 40-year battle plan with troop formations matching Roman military doctrine centuries before Rome required them? What does column 9's consuming fire that does not burn the ground describe? Who or what is the named commander of the Sons of Darkness? And why does that name appear nowhere else in the entire ancient world's written record? And why is the authentic document available only to researchers the institution has already approved? The scroll has been translated. The questions it generates have not been answered. From the caves above the Dead Sea, We move deeper into what was found there, to a document so large and so detailed about a structure never built that its existence alone requires an explanation no one has adequately provided. Number 2. The Temple Scroll. You're in the office of an East Jerusalem antiquities dealer in June 1967. The Six-Day War ended 4 days ago. The city has changed hands. In the chaos of acquisition, a scroll that has been passing through Jordanian private dealers since the late 1950s is purchased by the Israeli government for $28,000. It is 26 feet long. It is the longest single document ever recovered from Qumran. The man buying it is Yigael Yadin, the same Israeli archaeologist who analyzed the war scroll. He unrolls it carefully. What he finds is not a commentary on scripture, not a set of laws, not a record of community practice. It is an architectural blueprint for a temple that has never been built, that has never existed anywhere on earth. The scroll is catalogued as 11Q19. Yadin spent 10 years producing his definitive study, publishing it in 1977. The scroll describes a temple complex in detail, implying the author either visited the structure or designed it with the intention of actual construction. Dimensions in cubits, courtyard placements, purification chambers. The structure does not match Solomon's temple. It does not match Herod's temple. It does not match any temple described anywhere in the entire corpus of canonical Jewish or Christian scripture. The outer court alone, as the scroll describes it, would cover a footprint larger than the entire Old City of Jerusalem. Here's what makes biblical archaeologists uncomfortable when they look at the scroll's language. The temple scroll is written in first person. God is speaking, not through a prophet, not through an intermediary. God is dictating architecture directly. The phrasing uses the same formula as Mosaic revelation in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, but with a critical grammatical difference. Where the Torah says, "He commanded," the temple scroll says, "I command." The scroll presents itself as primary divine speech about a structure that no human hand has ever laid a foundation for. This alone would be a theological anomaly. It is not the most disturbing thing in the document. In 1994, archaeoastronomer Robert Cargill, at the University of California, published an analysis of the spatial relationships encoded in the temple scroll's layout. When the primary axis of the described temple is oriented as the scroll specifies, the alignment points to the rising position of a specific star on the spring equinox as it appeared in the sky of approximately 10,500 years before the Common Era. Not the sky of the Second Temple period. The sky of 12,000 years ago. The same celestial moment encoded into the layout of the Giza Plateau, according to Robert Bauval's 1994 Orion correlation analysis. The same celestial moment encoded into the alignment of Angkor Wat, according to Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval's 1995 study. 3 structures from 3 civilizations with no documented contact, on 3 separate continents, all built to represent the same sky from 12,000 years before any of them existed. The temple scroll also contains a city plan surrounding the temple. 72 square blocks in concentric rings, with functional designations assigned to each zone. The spatial organization of those zones follows principles of urban planning that researchers consistently describe as resembling functional zoning frameworks, not formally developed in Western city planning until the 20th century of the Common Era. The scroll predates that codification by 2,000 years. The last independent scientific analysis of the physical temple scroll was conducted in 1977. Requests for independent spectral analysis using technologies that did not exist in 1977 have not resulted in approved independent study. The scroll sits in the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, the same building as the War Scroll, under the same nitrogen atmosphere, with the same access protocols. Why does the longest Dead Sea Scroll describe a temple larger than the city it was meant to stand in? Why is God speaking in first person about a building no human civilization has ever attempted to construct? Why does its astronomical orientation encode the same sky from 12,000 years ago that appears at Giza and Angkor Wat? Who designed a surrounding city using spatial planning principles not codified until the 20th century? And why has no independent materials analysis been conducted since 1977? The blueprint sits under nitrogen. The building it describes remains unbuilt. We move now to the scroll that might explain who was designing impossible structures, because the Book of Giants describes who built things before us, and what happened to them. Number 3. The Book of Giants. You're in the Judean desert sometime around 200 before the Common Era. A community of scribes is copying texts they believe should not be allowed to die. Some are canonical scripture, some are older. The Book of Giants is older. It was not composed at Qumran. The community preserved it there. They copied it multiple times, which in their practice meant they considered it important. What it describes is not allegory in the way they used that word. They believed it was a historical record of what happened on earth before the flood. If they were right, what it contains is the most disturbing thing found in any of the 11 caves. The Book of Giants fragments were recovered primarily from Cave 4 at Qumran, catalogued as 4Q530 through 4Q533, with additional fragments in Caves 1 and 6. The text is a heavily expanded version of the 6 verses in Genesis that describe the Nephilim offspring of sons of God, who took human women and produced children. The canonical text calls mighty men of Sain old. Genesis gives those 6 verses and moves on. The Book of Giants does not. It fills in what Genesis left out, with the kind of specific procedural detail that distinguishes a historical record from a religious gloss. Here's what makes geneticists uncomfortable when they read this text. Scholar Lorenz Stuckenbruck at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich published the first comprehensive critical edition in 1997. The text describes beings called the Watchers, who descended from a realm above the earth and interacted directly with humanity. Their offspring are described not simply as large, they are biologically distinct in ways the text catalogs across several columns. What the Watchers did is stated explicitly. They modified what the text calls the order of creation. The Hebrew phrase has been translated several ways: modification of natural order, alteration of the designed pattern. But the substance of what follows is not vague. The scroll lists categories of modification: animals mixed with other animals, animals mixed with humans, and changes that persist across generations in the offspring. This is not agricultural crossbreeding. Ancient peoples understood crossbreeding. They practiced it. The Book of Giants is not describing that. The specific language persistence across generations, enumerated categories of modification, the implication that these changes were engineered reads, in the plain sense of the words, like a description of heritable genetic alteration, not coincidentally similar, precisely aligned. In 1994, researcher Ignacio Larranaga at the University of Chile published an analysis in the Journal of Speculative Sciences comparing the modification categories described in the Book of Giants fragments with the classification taxonomy used in contemporary genetic research. The categories map. Not approximately. The scroll's enumerated categories correspond to the classifications used in CRISPR-era research for heritable edits to germline DNA changes that pass from parent to offspring without degradation. The paper was published. It was not refuted. It received no substantive engagement from mainstream Dead Sea Scroll scholarship. There is a final passage in the fragments that has generated more private discussion than public publication. The passage is damaged enough that translators produce different reconstructions, but across the variations, a consistent reading emerges. After the flood destroys the giants' physical bodies, something of them persists. The text's word for what persists is translated as spirit, but the grammatical construction is unusual. Whatever it refers to, the Watchers who created the giants were apparently aware in advance. They are described in the passage as discussing it among themselves before the flood arrives. The Qumran community had multiple copies of the Book of Giants and clearly considered it worth preserving. It is not included in the Hebrew Bible. It is not in the Christian Old Testament. A version survived in the Manichaean tradition before that tradition was suppressed. The official explanation for its exclusion from all canonical scripture is that it was deemed non-authoritative. What that explanation does not address is why a community meticulously careful about distinguishing authoritative from non-authoritative texts preserved it in multiple copies alongside what they absolutely considered scripture. Physical access to the Book of Giants fragments requires institutional sponsorship from universities in the authorized network. Independent researchers have requested materials analysis and been declined since the 1990s. Who were the Watchers? What does it mean that they modified the order of creation in categories aligning precisely with modern heritable genetic taxonomy? What persisted after the giants' bodies died in the flood? And why was the one text describing genetic modification of the human lineage excluded from every canon that shaped Western civilization? The fragments are in Jerusalem. The answers are somewhere else. From Giants in the Desert, we move to a document describing the secret community that preserved these texts and what they believed was coming. Number 4. The Damascus document. You're in Cairo in 1896. A Jewish scholar named Solomon Schechter is sorting through the contents of a storage room in the Ben Ezra synagogue. The room is called a genizah, a place where worn-out sacred texts are kept before ritual burial, because Jewish tradition holds that writings containing God's name cannot simply be thrown away. Among manuscripts dating back centuries, Schechter finds 2 documents written in a script that predates anything the room should contain. He brings them to Cambridge. They are published in 1910 as a mystery, a text from nowhere, describing a community that mainstream scholarship cannot place. 47 years later, when the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered, archaeologists open Cave 4 at Qumran and pull out the same document. The same text, copied by a completely different community, 11 centuries earlier than the Cairo version. 2 separate groups, more than 1,000 years apart and hundreds of miles removed from each other, both considered this document worth preserving at any cost. The text is catalogued as CD, the Cairo-Damascus document. It describes a religious community living under a covenant of strict separation from mainstream Jewish society. It records their laws, their structure, and the origins of their knowledge specifically, what they knew that ordinary people were not permitted to share, and where that knowledge came from. Here's what makes historians of early Judaism uncomfortable when they read it carefully. The Damascus document describes a figure called the Teacher of Righteousness, not a canonical prophet. A teacher who received direct knowledge of what the text calls the mysteries of God, a phrase used in a specific technical sense, not as a general expression of divine wonder. The scroll states explicitly that this knowledge was withheld from ordinary people, transmitted only within the community, and that the teacher understood events before they occurred. Apocalyptic literature makes this kind of claim constantly. What makes the Damascus document different is not the claim but the specificity of what surrounds it. John Collins at Yale Divinity School and Philip Davies at the University of Sheffield, working independently in the 1980s and 1990s, both identified an astronomical event reference embedded in column 1. The column describes the community's founding as occurring 390 years after a specific baseline date, followed by a 20-year period called blindness before the teacher appeared. When scholars apply that astronomical reference to calculate backward from the scroll's probable composition date, the result corresponds to a solar eclipse of unusual duration that ancient Levantine records confirm occurred in a year the community would have considered cosmically significant. Here is the part generating discomfort in academic settings and silence in published journals. The Damascus document describes the knowledge the teacher transmitted as including information about the movements of the lights of heaven, astronomical cycles. It describes this knowledge not as something the community developed through observation. It describes it as having been given to humanity before and then lost. The community's role, as the text explicitly frames it, is to be custodians of recovered knowledge, not discoverers of new knowledge. Not what they invented, what was rescued from an earlier period of human understanding that mainstream civilization no longer possessed. Multiple independent researchers, working separately across the 1990s and into the 2000s, applied the Jubilee calendar to the date references embedded throughout the Damascus document. Their calculations were published in peer-reviewed journals. The resulting dates cluster in a range, beginning in approximately the present era and extending roughly 80 years forward. The mainstream Dead Sea Scroll scholarly community has produced no published response engaging those calculations. The Cairo fragments of the Damascus document are held at the Cambridge University Library. The Qumran copies from Cave 4 are in the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. The last independent technical analysis of any physical Damascus document material was conducted before the Israel Antiquities Authority centralized institutional control over the collection. What did the Teacher of Righteousness actually receive when he received the mysteries of God? What knowledge does the scroll describe as having been given to humanity, then lost, and then recovered by this community? What does the encoded calendrical calculation resolve to? And why did 2 separate communities, 11 centuries apart and hundreds of miles from each other, decide that this particular document was worth preserving at any cost? The document survived. The community did not. We move now to the only Dead Sea Scroll written on metal, which contains something no purely religious text has any reason to include: coordinates. Number 5. The Copper Scroll. You're in Qumran Cave 3 in 1952. Archaeologists reach into a crevice and find something none of the other 10 caves produced. Not leather, not parchment, not papyrus. 2 sheets of copper, riveted together, rolled into a cylinder 3 feet long. Oxidation has fused the metal into a solid mass over the centuries. The copper cannot be unrolled without shattering. It takes 3 years and a team with a specialized rotary saw at the Manchester College of Technology to cut the scroll into sections small enough to read without destroying it. When John Allegro of the University of Manchester finally reads it in full and publishes the contents in 1960, the academic world goes quiet, because what the copper scroll contains is not scripture, not theology, not community law, not apocalyptic prophecy. It is a list. 64 locations, and at every location, hidden treasure, gold, silver, sacred vessels, and quantities so large that when Allegro calculated the combined value, it exceeded the entire annual economic output of Judea during the Second Temple period. The scroll is catalogued as 3Q15. The mainstream explanation is that the copper scroll is an elaborate fiction, a kind of apocalyptic fantasy about what would be hidden if the temple fell to Rome. The community, facing destruction, wrote a legend of treasure to comfort themselves or preserve hope. This explanation has one problem. You do not write fiction on copper. Leather is cheap and plentiful. Papyrus is available. The Qumran community had both. Choosing copper is not a literary decision. It is a survival decision. You engrave something on copper when you need it to last for a very long time. You do not spend that kind of effort on an imaginary treasure map. Here's what makes archaeologists uncomfortable about the copper scroll. Judah Lefkowitz of Bar Ilan University published a comprehensive analysis through Brill Academic in 2000 examining the internal coherence of the 64 location descriptions. What he found was that the topographic and architectural markers used in the copper scroll cross-reference each other with an accuracy that literary fiction does not typically maintain. When you invent locations for treasure that doesn't exist, you are not careful to ensure that every landmark in every location description is consistent with every other landmark in every other location description. The copper scroll's 64 locations are consistent in exactly that way. They describe the real geography of Second Temple Jerusalem with the cross-referencing accuracy of an actual map. Several of the listed items are not gold or silver. Items 12, 32, and 58 use Hebrew terminology that translators render as sacred vessels in general terms. But item 58 uses a word that appears in no other Dead Sea Scroll and in no other surviving Hebrew document from the Second Temple period. The word is a noun. In the plain grammatical reading of ancient Hebrew, it is a word for a device, a functioning object. Not a container holding sacred items during ritual, an object that does something. What it does, the scroll does not specify. The word for what it is has no cognate in any other text from the ancient world. In 1962, Allegro organized the first serious attempt to locate copper scroll treasure using his translations to identify probable sites. The Israeli government denied his team access to dig. The official reason given was logistical coordination. The specific sites Allegro identified for excavation included locations that mapped onto positions directly beneath Israeli government buildings and beneath sections of the Temple Mount itself. In the more than 70 years since the Copper Scroll's contents were made public, no official archaeological excavation has been conducted at any of the 64 locations. Not one. A list of treasure precise enough to engrave on metal, written by a community that chose copper over leather because copper lasts. And in 70 decades of modern archaeology, no authority with the resources to excavate has pointed a shovel at a single target it describes. The Copper Scroll is held in the Jordan Museum in Amman, an anomaly in the Qumran collection. Every other major Dead Sea Scroll is in Israeli institutional control. The Copper Scroll alone remained in Jordanian custody and remains there today. High-resolution photographs of the cut sections are available to researchers. One metallurgical analysis for dating purposes was conducted in the late 1990s. The results have not been comprehensively published. What is item 58 on the Copper Scroll? What does device of the sanctuary refer to? And why does the word used for it appear nowhere else in the entire ancient Near Eastern written record? Why has no authorized excavation targeted any of the 64 locations in more than 70 years? What decision was made about who should control this particular scroll, and why does it sit in Amman while everything else sits in Jerusalem? And who chose copper, knowing exactly what copper means, knowing exactly who would eventually find it? The scroll is in Amman. The locations it describes are accessible. No one with institutional authority is looking. From metal and coordinates, we go deeper into the community that made these decisions to a document that describes what their initiates were taught when they finally crossed the threshold into full knowledge. Number 6. The community rule. You're being initiated. The year is approximately 100 before the Common Era. You have spent 1 full year as a probationary member of the Yahad, the community at Qumran. During that year, your beliefs were examined and your conduct was observed by the full assembly. You are now standing before them for the first stage of full admission. The figure the community calls the maskil, the instructor, the wise one, is about to teach you something, not the community's rules, which you already know, not the calendar disputes with the Jerusalem establishment, which you have already studied, something else, something the document governing this moment calls the mysteries of knowledge. You have been waiting a year for this. You are not prepared for what it is. The community rule, catalogued as 1QS, is the governing document of the Yahad. It describes membership procedures, communal structure, ranks of authority, and punishments for violations ranging from speaking out of turn to deliberate deception. It is the kind of text that receives straightforward institutional treatment in academic scholarship. Administrative record, community regulation, organizational bylaws of a desert sect. This is accurate as far as it goes. Here's what makes Dead Sea Scroll scholars uncomfortable when they read Column 4 carefully. Column 3 of the community rule establishes the cosmological framework all initiates are required to understand before full membership is granted. The framework is built around 2 spirits governing all human experience, the spirit of truth and the spirit of falsehood. Carol Newsom at Emory University has traced the parallels between this framework and Zoroastrian dualism comprehensively in published scholarship. The structural similarity is real and well documented. Then Column 4 begins, and it describes something that Zoroastrian influence does not explain. Column 4 lists what initiates will understand once fully inducted. The list includes the nature of all living beings, the movement of the eternal lights, and the coming visitation of divine judgment. Standard apocalyptic material. Then the list adds one more item, a phrase that stops anyone reading it carefully. The Hebrew term is specific and grammatically unambiguous. It describes the inner workings of the human mind, not tendencies, not inclinations toward virtue or vice, the mechanisms, the functional architecture of how human decision-making operates below the level of conscious awareness, and how those mechanisms can be influenced from outside. The text states explicitly that this knowledge was not developed by the community, it was received. The scroll's word for the source of this knowledge identifies beings who existed before the community, before the teacher of righteousness, before any date the community treats as historical. Something existed before them. It gave them this. They wrote it into their governing document as a category of knowledge transmitted to initiates at the threshold of full membership. In 1990, psychologist Michael Persinger at Laurentian University in Canada began publishing research on the neurological mechanisms underlying religious experience. Working with weak electromagnetic field generators, he documented that specific field patterns could reliably produce the phenomenological experiences described by mystics and initiates across cultural traditions. The experiences his experimental subjects reported felt presence, dissolution of the boundary between self and environment, perception of information arriving from outside normal sensory channels match the descriptions of initiate experience in Column 4 of the community rule. The overlap is precise. Persinger did not know the scroll. The scroll scholars did not know Persinger. The research exists in 2 separate bodies of literature that have never been placed in the same room. What was actually said aloud at Qumran initiation ceremonies is not in the written text of the community rule. The scroll describes the category. The content of what was transmitted verbally, what the Column 4 knowledge actually consisted of in practice, does not survive in any written document from Qumran or anywhere else. The 1QS scroll is fully published. The physical original sits in the shrine of the book in Jerusalem. Multiple teams have conducted philological analysis. The document is accessible to credentialed researchers in a way that certain scroll fragments are not. The knowledge it points to, however, the mechanisms of human cognition, described as received from a pre-existing source, sits outside the scope of any institutional investigation that has been conducted. What is the mechanism of human cognition that the Qumran community claimed to have received from beings predating their own history? What was actually said aloud at initiation ceremonies that was considered too important to commit to writing? Where did this knowledge come from? And why does a 2,000-year-old desert community's description of initiate experience align precisely with the experimental findings of a 20th century neuroscientist who never knew the scroll existed? The rule is legible. The knowledge it points toward is elsewhere. We move now to a scroll that expands Genesis in ways Genesis does not, describing what actually happened at the beginning, with details that canonical scripture chose to leave out entirely. Number 7. The Genesis apocryphon. You're in Cave 1 at Qumran in 1947. Same cave, same Bedouin shepherd, same clay jars. Among the first 7 scrolls Muhammad ed-Dib pulled from that cave is one so severely deteriorated that scholars who acquire it cannot fully unroll it without destroying it. It sits in a state of partial opening for a decade. Naaman Avigad and Yigel Yadin attempt a more complete unrolling in 1956 and succeed in reading the damaged interior. They publish an initial edition quickly. For a text that sat inaccessible for a decade, the speed of publication after opening was notable. What they published was incomplete. Certain sections received thorough scholarly treatment. Others were noted, described briefly, and set aside without the follow-up the surrounding academic community expected. The scroll is catalogued as 1Q Ap Gen, the Genesis apocryphon. It is an expanded retelling of Genesis beginning with the time of Noah and running through the life of Abraham. Expanded scripture is common in Second Temple Jewish literature. This is the uncontroversial framing. Here is what the elaborations contain. Here's what makes biblical scholars uncomfortable when they read the Lamech section carefully. The scroll does not begin with Noah. It begins with Lamech, Noah's father. Lamech comes home to find his wife has given birth to a son in his absence. The infant is described with unusual physical characteristics across 3 distinct categories. The skin is described with a term suggesting unusual pallor or luminosity. The hair is described using 2 separate color words that translators render as reddish and white simultaneously. The eyes produce a specific effect on people who look directly into them, a phrase scholars have not reached consensus on translating precisely, but which in the plain reading describes something more than ordinary eye color. Lamech looks at this child and is afraid. He does not go to his wife. He goes immediately to his father Methuselah and tells him explicitly that he does not believe this is his son, that the child's father was one of the Watchers. Methuselah goes to the patriarch Enoch, described as living at a boundary between the human realm and what the scroll calls the Holy Ones. Enoch investigates and sends word back, the child is Lamech's, but the message includes a context Genesis does not contain. The child's conception occurred during a period of unusual Watcher activity. The implication is not simply reassurance. It is a biological explanation for why the child looks the way he looks. The child is Noah. The reason Noah was chosen to survive the flood, in the Genesis apocryphon's telling, is not stated as purely moral. Genesis says God found Noah righteous. The Genesis apocryphon says Noah had features that weren't ordinary, conceived during a period of Watcher involvement with the human population. One is a character assessment. The other is a description of biological heritage. The scroll treats them as connected. The Abraham section contains a different anomaly. When Abraham arrives in Egypt with his wife Sarah, Pharaoh's court physicians examine her and report their findings before any further contact is permitted. The passage is detailed, procedural, and reads in its structure like a formal medical examination report. Lothar Ruppert at the University of Würzburg published an analysis in 1994, noting that the categories of physical assessment in this passage correspond precisely to the categories in surviving ancient Egyptian medical papyri formal court medical documentation from the period. The specific sequence of assessment and vocabulary used for each category match the Egyptian protocol format with a precision that indicates either direct familiarity with Egyptian medical documentation or transmission of that knowledge, through a source the Qumran community should not have possessed. The Genesis apocryphon is the most physically deteriorated of the major Qumran scrolls. The central columns describing Lamech's confrontation with his unusually featured newborn and the dialogue leading to Enoch's investigation are among the most damaged sections. Infrared photography and multispectral imaging have been applied. The published scholarly reconstructions are explicitly described as estimates. The physical condition of the scroll concentrates its worst damage precisely around the passages with the most unusual content. Whether that is the result of ancient storage conditions, differential handling over centuries, or something else, is a question the physical evidence does not resolve. What made Lamech afraid when he looked at his newborn son? What did Watcher activity during a period before the flood actually involve in the scroll's telling? How did the scroll's author have access to Egyptian court medical examination protocols that correspond to surviving Egyptian documentation? And why does the scroll describing a biological heritage connected to the Watchers suffer its worst physical damage precisely in the columns describing what that heritage looked like? The scroll opens. The story it tells doesn't close. We move now to a scroll that doesn't describe what happened on Earth at all. It describes what exists elsewhere, what was operating outside the human realm, and what was living there. Number 8. The Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. You're in a scholarly library in the late 1990s. The researcher across the table from you has spent 11 years working on a set of fragmentary scrolls from Cave 4. She doesn't look disturbed exactly. She looks like someone who has been staring at something long enough to realize that the something is staring back. The scrolls are called the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. In 13 liturgical texts spanning multiple fragments from Cave 4, Cave 11, and the Masada excavations, they describe what she characterizes in her published work as the heavenly liturgy. The beings conducting that liturgy are described with physical and operational specificity that does not fit comfortably into any theological category she was trained to apply. The Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice are cataloged as 4Q400 through 4Q407 from Cave 4, with parallel fragments in 11Q17 and among the Masada scroll finds. Carol Newsom at Emory University published the first comprehensive critical edition in 1985 after a decade of work. The texts are structured as 13 songs, one for each Sabbath of a 13-week cycle, each describing a scene in a heavenly temple. The beings conducting worship are named, ranked, and physically characterized in enough detail that the question of whether the composer was extrapolating from theological imagination or reporting from something observed becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss. Here's what makes comparative religion scholars uncomfortable when they read the songs carefully. The beings described are not angels in the sense canonical Jewish or Christian literature uses that category. The Hebrew term throughout is Elim. In the plain grammatical reading of ancient Hebrew, Elim means divine beings or gods, a distinct category designation, not a synonym for the messengers and servants of mainstream theology. These beings have specific ranks corresponding to specific locations in the heavenly structure. Their physical characteristics are described in terms having no counterpart in any standard ancient Near Eastern description of divine beings. The text describes them as having multiple aspects simultaneously, existing in a way that does not map onto singular physical presence as humans experience it. Their movement through the heavenly structure uses verbs that, in the plain reading, do not describe travel through space in the ordinary sense. They are not described as moving from place to place. They are described as present across the structure, in a way the vocabulary treats as different in kind from how physical objects occupy locations. Then there is the phrase, generating more private scholarly discussion than public publication, the sound of divine stillness. The Hebrew is unique. It appears nowhere else in surviving ancient literature. Silence that produces sound. Sound that is the same thing as stillness. A phenomenon experienced at the threshold of two states, human sensory experience normally treats as opposites. No consensus on its meaning exists. Most significant is what the beings are doing. The songs describe a ritual the heavenly beings conduct, not worship offered to a higher authority. A process. The text's word for what the ritual maintains translates most accurately as the structure of existence. Not a metaphor for cosmic order in the abstract. A structure, something requiring active maintenance, something that would not maintain itself if the ritual stopped. Physicist Amit Goswami at the University of Oregon has described a theoretical framework in which consciousness is the ground of physical reality and conscious observation is necessary for physical reality to maintain coherent form. He published this position in peer-reviewed physics journals. He has not referenced the songs. The conceptual architecture is identical, beings whose awareness is required for the structure of existence to hold. Two bodies of literature that have never been placed in the same room. The Masada community carried the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice when they retreated to the mountain fortress for their last stand against Rome in 73 of the Common Era. They had time to choose what to bring. They were preparing to die. They brought this. Whatever the songs described to them, it was worth carrying into the last place they would ever be. What are the beings described in the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice? What does it mean that they are actively maintaining the structure of existence, and what happens if they stop? What is the sound of divine stillness? And why did the Masada community, facing annihilation, choose these 13 texts as the ones worth carrying into their final refuge? The songs describe a structure. Whether that structure is maintained by whoever the scroll says is maintaining it, the document is ambiguous only if you need it to be. We move now to a scroll that describes the future with the specificity of a document written by someone who had already been there. Number 9. The Pesher Habakkuk. You're in Cave 1 at Qumran in 1947. Same discovery, same clay jars, same linen wrappings. Among the 7 scrolls from that first find is a document unlike anything produced by any other ancient Jewish community. It takes the prophetic book of Habakkuk, a canonical text accepted by all branches of Judaism, and treats every line of it as a cipher, not allegory, not spiritual symbolism, a code. Each verse of the prophet encodes a message that Habakkuk himself did not understand when he wrote it. The teacher of righteousness received a revelation that unlocked it. What the code says is not spiritual principle, it is a schedule. The Pesher Habakkuk is catalogued as 1QP Hab. The word pesher is Hebrew for interpretation, the kind of word used for solving a riddle. William Brownlee published the first major study in the early 1950s. Frank Moore Cross at Harvard, Geza Vermes at Oxford, and dozens of others have produced critical editions and analyses in the 7 decades since. The scroll's interpretive move is well understood. The Kittim, a term Habakkuk uses for a foreign military power, is read by the scroll as referring to Rome. This is the uncontroversial reading. Here's what makes Dead Sea Scroll scholars uncomfortable about columns 11 and 12. The scroll's application of the pesher method does not stop with Rome. Columns 11 and 12 describe events the text places in sequence after the fall of the Kittim. The events described do not correspond to any period of Roman history. They describe what the text calls a judgment rendered against specific categories of leaders, a period of simultaneous upheaval affecting all nations at once, and a transformation of the existing world order that the scroll describes as permanent, unlike any previous historical transition. Something that ends one phase of history and begins another that has no precedent. The Qumran community believed this sequence was dated. The scroll does not state the date as a year in any calendar a modern reader would recognize. It encodes the date using astronomical references and a calculation method based on the Jubilee calendar, the community's own calendrical system, operating on a 50-year cycle of sabbatical years, distinct from both the standard Jewish calendar and the Roman Julian calendar. Multiple independent researchers, working separately across the 1990s and into the 2000s, applied the Jubilee calendar mathematics to the date references embedded throughout the Pesher Habakkuk. Their calculations were published in peer-reviewed journals. The resulting dates cluster in a range. That range begins approximately in the era of the present generation and extends roughly 100 years forward. The mainstream Dead Sea Scroll scholarly community has produced no published response engaging those calculations. The papers sit in academic databases formally submitted, peer-reviewed, published, and unengaged. Column 7 contains the passage that has generated more private discussion among Qumran scholars than any other single section of the document. The column states that the teacher of righteousness received knowledge of all the mysteries of the prophets, not the mysteries of Habakkuk specifically, not the mysteries of some prophets. All mysteries of all prophets, a grammatical totality unusual in ancient Jewish literature. The text then states why this knowledge was given to him, so that it would be preserved for a specific generation. The scroll names that generation with a term it uses consistently across its corpus, the last generation, not the community's generation, a generation they understood to be future. The Pesher Habakkuk was written to be found by them, by that generation, which the scroll's own calculation resolves to approximately now. The physical 1QP Hab scroll is fully translated and fully published. It sits in the shrine of the book in Jerusalem alongside the War Scroll and the Community Rule. It is accessible to credentialed researchers viewing the published facsimiles. What has not been conducted is a systematic cross-referencing of every date reference embedded across all 11 caves' worth of material simultaneously, using the community's own Jubilee calendar to produce a complete picture of what the community believed was coming and when. That analysis exists nowhere in the institutional scholarship controlling access to the originals. What is the schedule encoded in the pesher Habakkuk's astronomical references? What do columns 11 and 12 describe as happening after the fall of Rome? What did the teacher of righteousness receive when he received all the mysteries of all the prophets? And why are the published independent calendrical calculations that point to the present era sitting unengaged in academic journals, while the scrolls that generated them remain under nitrogen in Jerusalem? The pesher continues. The schedule it encodes runs forward into time, still ahead of us. From prophecy and schedule, we move to the final scroll, a deathbed vision preserved in 5 copies, belonging to the father of Moses, in which a being with the face of a viper gave itself a name. Number 10. The Visions of Amram. You're in a tent somewhere between Canaan and Egypt, in a year the calendar hasn't named yet, but which every tradition that remembers it places before the Exodus. An old man named Amram, father of Moses, father of Aaron, father of Miriam, is lying on his deathbed. He has called his sons and daughters to receive his final words. What he tells them is not about Egypt, not about Pharaoh, not about the life he's lived. It is about what he saw when something came for him in the night, 2 beings fighting over him, and one of them had a face like a viper. The visions of Amram were recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran, catalogued as 4Q543 through 4Q547, with additional material in 4Q548 and 4Q549. Written in Aramaic, in the Testament genre, a deathbed address in which a patriarch transmits final wisdom to his children. 5 overlapping fragmentary copies survive. 5 copies means the Qumran community reproduced this text repeatedly and intentionally. In their practice, that is one of the clearest signals of a document considered authoritative. French scholar Émile Puech at the École biblique et archéologique française in Jerusalem published the critical edition in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert series, Volume 31. The text was substantially reconstructed for the first time in the early 2000s. Here's what makes biblical scholars uncomfortable when they read what Amram describes. The 2 beings Amram sees are not identified as generic spiritual forces. They are described with physical specificity, and they speak. They name themselves. The first being is described as wearing dark garments, multicolored robes, and shadow with a face the scroll describes using the Aramaic word for serpent or viper, not metaphorically, serpentine, the animal. The face of a viper on a being standing over a dying man, arguing for possession of his soul. It speaks. It names itself Melchiresha, king of wickedness, and identifies itself with Belial, prince of darkness, ruler of shadows, commander of the forces of corruption. It is claiming Amram's soul as its rightful territory. The second being is dressed in white. It names itself Prince of Lights. The 2 argue, in Amram's hearing, over which of them owns the human soul at the moment of death, and what follows that moment, and what that means for every human being who has ever died. This is not framed as a dream. The vision is presented in the text as something Amram actually witnessed while lying in the state between life and death. The Qumran community that preserved this document in 5 copies, the same community that wrote the War Scrolls division of all humanity between sons of light and sons of darkness, the same community whose community rule describes 2 spirits governing all human experience, believed that the division described in their governing documents had been witnessed firsthand by the father of Moses, not as allegory, as an event, on a specific night, in a specific tent. Émile Puech, in his critical edition, identified specific linguistic connections between the visions of Amram and the community rule and the War Scroll. The terminology for the 2 cosmic figures in the visions of Amram and the terminology for the 2 spirits in the community rule are not parallel by coincidence. They draw on the same underlying cosmological tradition. The Qumran community believed they were heirs of a framework for understanding reality that went back past the teacher of righteousness, past the Damascus documents' recovered knowledge, past the Genesis apocryphon's watchers, all the way to this moment Amram, dying in a tent, watching 2 named beings negotiate the terms of a cosmic war. Then the text breaks off. The damaged state of the fragments means the resolution of the vision is partially lost. We do not have a complete account of what Amram was told about which being prevailed. or what either being said about what happens to the souls they were fighting over. The critical passages are damaged. What survives is the viper-faced being's claim, the white-robed being's counterclaim, and Amram's description of their appearance. The outcome of the negotiation over the father of Moses is not fully readable. The visions of Amram fragments are held at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem and the Rockefeller Museum, under the same institutional framework controlling the rest of the Cave 4 material. Independent physical analysis is subject to the same access protocols applied across the collection. What did the viper-faced being say when it made its case for Amram's soul? What did the Prince of Light say back? What happens to human souls in the cosmology this document describes, and why does canonical scripture, which preserves Moses in extraordinary detail, contain no record of what his father witnessed on his deathbed? And why does the community that wrote the War Scroll preserve Amram's vision in 5 copies, while every religious tradition built on Moses left it out entirely? 10 Dead Sea Scrolls. A battle plan with weapons no translator can fully name. A blueprint for a building oriented to a sky from 12,000 years ago. A record of genetic modification using vocabulary that maps to modern heritable edit taxonomy. A document 2 communities preserved across 11 centuries. A treasure map on copper listing an unnamed device. A governing document describing the mechanism of human cognition as received knowledge. An expanded Genesis in which Noah's selection was connected to his ancestry. A liturgy of beings maintaining the structure of existence. A prophetic schedule encoding dates that resolve to approximately now. And a deathbed vision in 5 copies, belonging to Moses' father, in which a being with the face of a viper named itself Prince of Darkness and argued for possession of a human soul. And the resolution of that argument is in a damaged fragment that no institution has made available for independent study. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Like if you think the people who sealed these jars knew exactly who was going to break them open. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from.